What are your thoughts on someone who has a combination of hyperkyphosis and hyperlordosis with both rib flares? Could these be due to mouth breathing as a compensation for improper breathing patterns? And how would you try to improve it? Awesome question, Kresimir. So let me tackle one piece first. What is the cause of someone who has hyperlordosis, so a deep arch in their lower back, hyperkyphosis, a deep curve in their upper back, and rib flares? Rib flares are when the lower rib cage is prominent. What causes that? Here's the answer. I don't know. There's probably a lot of factors at play as to why that's caused. I'm sure there's a combination of genetics, epigenetics, and environmental or movement, or not even movement, but environmental-based factors that lead to someone exhibiting a certain posture. And there's a great video that my dear friend and father, Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman, put out this week. This is very timely. Like, check it out. I'll link it in the show notes, which, of course, will be found on zachcouples.com/lumbar. But check that out. Like, we can't, and I will echo what he said, we can't necessarily obsess and worry so much about static postures because there are some things that we can't change, and that's how we look to some extent. If someone's exhibiting a particular posture, there's likely some structural bias that predisposes that person to having that. So unless you're going to change your structure somehow, you might have that to some degree. What is more important in this case is restoring the available movement options within that structure. In the case of someone with lordosis and rib flares, if you can't minimize the rib flare or reverse your lumbar curve, then that's a problem. But achieving a static positioning that we think is good is less desirable because we are not static creatures. We are creatures who are meant to move. So please move. But what would you do about someone who has a large lordotic curve and rib flares and maybe they have a hard time reversing that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The big thing you have to do is you have to find some type of position that allows that person to achieve the stack. The stack being, and this is where someone who's got a big lordotic curve may have a hard time, would be achieving some degree of posterior tilt, exhaling the lower rib cage so the ribs drop down. That, in theory, puts the thoracic and pelvic diaphragm atop one another, and that gives you the potential for movement options in many directions. If I have a hyperlordotic curve, where the C shape of the lumbar spine is increased, so you have at least lower lumbar extension, you have a pelvis that's oriented or tilted anteriorly, that person may have a challenge creating the posterior tilt needed for a stack. So that's why that could be problematic if you can't reverse that, because there will inevitably be a reduction of movement options available. We want to see if we can teach someone to reverse that, like your favorite Missy Elliott song. What I like to do for these types of people is, if they are someone with a deep lordosis, you may be better served doing tucking or posterior tilting in the side-lying position, because a lot of times people who have a deep lordotic curve, though it's not always the case, are wide infrasternal angle presentations. And if they're not wide ISAs, they're certainly trying to be because of secondary compensations. If you're unfamiliar what a secondary compensation is, I got a good debrief that I'll link in the show notes. And I'll also link something about stacking, because I want you to be able to talk to me. Side-lying position is useful for teaching a tuck because you're doing so in a gravity-eliminated plane. For example, when I try to do a posterior tilt in the supine position, I have to lift my pelvis up against gravity. That can be really challenging for someone with a deep lordotic curve. The side-lying position makes it a little bit easier because you don't have the influences of gravity. If I had to pick a side, which you're supposed to do nowadays, but if I had to pick a side, I would go to the right side, and the reason why that has to do with the inherent asymmetry that we have within our body. that may predispose us to having somewhat of a leftward force that we're constantly fighting against. Again, check out Bill Hartman. I'll link him in the show notes. He is way better versed in that than I am. But right side seems to be a little bit more effective for teaching this in that regard. So with that person, get them tucking. Make sure you're achieving a full exhale. Those two pieces right there, if you can get a good tuck and you can get a good full exhale, ought to teach that person to reduce the lordotic curve, and it should help them reduce the rib flaring. Because the rib flare is there because of the lordotic curve. That's one reason why the ribs are a little bit more prominent, is because the body is shifting its center of mass forward, and that's what makes the ribs more visible. If you do those things, then, and you can breathe in that position, maintaining that stacked position, you will get the potential to have multi-directional expansion in the upper thorax. That can improve the dynamics of the spine in that area. If you got someone with a hyperkyphosis, although having a true fully formed kyphosis is a bit rare, what I often see is a segmental kyphosis with flattening above and below. That will give you some expansion in that area to hopefully normalize the kyphotic curve from a movement perspective. I can't emphasize that enough. That would be the very first place that I would start. From there, it's a matter of trying to utilize as many different positions as possible to teach that person to keep that stacked position. Another thing that they will have a hard time with, but I would say is the pinnacle of reducing the lumbar curve, is being able to achieve a full squat, staying as vertical as possible through the ventral cavity as you can. With a anterior pelvic tilt and a lordotic curve, that person's pelvis is going to have a tendency to be pushed more posteriorly. We don't want that. If I can do a squat, then I can get maximal posterior tilting, and that's going to go in the exact opposite direction of the person with the deep lordosis and rib flare. And those would be the places that I would start someone with a hyperlordotic curve, rib flares, and kyphosis. To summarize, your amazing question, Krasimir, hopefully I pronounced it okay, but I got work to do. We don't need to concern ourselves too much with static posture. We are mobile creatures, so move and groove. You want to teach this person, however, to be able to reduce their lordotic curve, reduce the rib flare, reduce kyphosis, or actually make the kyphosis more uniform if you can from a movement perspective. The way you do that is, of course, teaching the stack. That has to happen. Sideline position's good. Your terminal exercise is a squat, and then you want to fill the gaps in between those. Amazing question.